Welcome to BTFDtv. My name's Jack Barnes, and I'm the host of this show. This is the Macro Tourist Hour, and for the next hour, we're going to be talking about different aspects of the macro big picture, what's happening in the world. If you've seen any of the episodes in the last 4 years, you know this is where I go to my co-host, otherwise known as Uncle Bob, and he puts us to sleep in the next 60 seconds talking about politics in D.C. Uncle Bob.
This week, a couple of notable things. Congress came back from their 5-week vacation, although they didn't have much to say other than bandying about on news shows. But the interesting thing of the week was Obama's press conference and his change in direction vis-a-vis ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever you want to call it, in Syria and Iraq. Basically, his line at this point in time, although we keep increasing the amount of advisors we send to...
no boots on the ground.
Right, no boots on the ground, other than boots. But that we're going to have significant air attacks. Those attacks now do include Syria, or will include Syria. Syria has bandied about some nonsense. Nobody's really paying much attention to them. Although they didn't have much.
Whoa, sorry, bad Jack. Go ahead.
There was something critically important I was going to say, but the only other really relevant point to mention is Obama had a off-the-record meeting with about 15 different journalists. 3 from the Times, Gary Sieb of the Wall Street Journal, a host of others. Notable name.
We can hear you, Tom. We can hear you.
Hi, back from the dead.
We have our primary guest. Sorry, Uncle Bob. Back to your rambling. What was that you were saying again?
No, I mean there's nothing much to report other than we can expect a good deal of activity relative to IS, the Islamic group that's operating in Syria and Iraq, and you'll continue to hear a lot of people second guessing, and that's that. We can talk about details as we go.
All right. First of all, Tom, welcome back. It's been a while. How was your summer vacation?
It's not really a vacation. It's is everybody gone?
No, we're here.
Oh, okay. Did a lot of writing, did a lot of research, getting ready curriculum for the new season, for the new term, for the War College. It's summers are busy. Taught at Harvard all summer, so that can be busy going to Boston. So yeah, it was great, but it was a wonderful summer. Great weather, terrific time down here by the beach. So it was a good time.
Right on. Well, welcome back. It's always a privilege when we have you here, and we're looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, we're overdue. I couldn't. Sundays are sometimes tough, but we made it work. So
this week we want to hit a couple of topics. One of them is Scotland and implications there, and even military implications. We have obviously possibly Spain and our friend from Spain joining us. He used to be in the British military, so he might have a thought or two on the non-United Kingdom. Potentiality, and we have our friend Mr. Putin and the reinvasion of food supplies. Only this time they didn't stop at the border; they just rolled. We have this organization that is claiming statehood that has become a priority of this nation. And you and I had discussed a couple of weeks ago about nations having strategies, having agendas. And since then, it appears that the government of the United States has decided to have an agenda. And so that would be a primary question. So at this stage now, I'm going to start shutting up, and Uncle Bob, I think you have a series of questions that you would like to run past our guests. And I will try to shut up.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think I just like to turn it over to the 2 gentlemen and kind of let them preface. I'm pretty well informed on the issues that are involved, and I do have some questions that I'd like to follow up. But Tom, I'd like to get your thoughts on the current situation in Ukraine and Russia, and kind of where you see it going.
Well, I never thought it would go this far. I somehow thought he would stop with that Putin would stop with hiving off Crimea as some sort of autonomous area next to Russia, but he decided to go the full Monty and actually seize it and annex it. I think he sees no reason to stop. And really, why, when you ask the question, why is Putin getting away with this? Because he's getting away with this. There's nothing to stop him. I mean, he's like a guy. I always use the casino analogy. He's like the guy on a hot streak, and he's going to keep throwing the dice. I don't know if you've ever been to, all decadent Westerners been to a casino. You've been around a craps table where the guy's just shooting and shooting and shooting, and at some point you just want to take the dice away and say, go cash in, because this won't last forever. And winning streaks are winning streaks right up until they're not. And my concern is that one of my biggest concerns about Putin in all of this, he really doesn't understand how the West works. And that surprises me, because he was in the KGB, he's been in public life and in Russian politics for 20 years. I think one of the scariest stories is always the one that's in Peter Baker's book, when Bush 43 is talking to him, and Putin says something like, well, I see you fired Dan Rather, when Rather had to step down over the whole Rathergate, when Dan Rather was basically being Dan Rather and had to step down. And Bush said, I can't fire Dan Rather. It doesn't work that way. And Putin said, no, come on, really. And finally Bush said, Vladimir, I don't think you ought to say that when we go out in front of this press conference, because people are going to think you don't understand how this country works. And that was in 2006. I don't think it's gotten any better. I think he doesn't understand how not just the Obama White House, but any White House works. I don't think he understands how Congress works. I don't think he understands how NATO works. And I think he figures this is all dependent, and this is my big fear. Putin thinks everything is dependent on the personality of one man, Barack Obama. And he's taken that guy's measure, but Putin has taken President Obama's measure and said, I can roll this guy. What he doesn't realize is that President Obama, he may be the chief decision maker in American security and the leader of the free world, but there are a lot of other people and 27 other countries in NATO. And at some point, he may go so far that the bureaucracy and the national security establishment and the militaries of NATO, that they all start rolling toward a different conclusion that even President Obama's going to have to go along with. And let me just link that to your Syria discussion earlier. How many times did people say, well, President Obama's never going to do that. He would never do that. He's committed. He came in ending wars. Iraq is over. Well, sometimes circumstances can become so extreme. Did anybody, I don't know if any of you guys watched Meet the Press this morning, but Chuck Todd did a pretty pointed piece where he put George Bush and Barack Obama side by side, and he said, don't they sound remarkably alike? And they would have something from President Obama's speech, and then have something from President Bush's speech. Americans are conditioned, and I think Putin unfortunately buys into this, we're conditioned to believe that presidents are terribly unique and that every change in administration turns the world upside down. It doesn't work that way. Every president can be pushed to a point where the rest of the national security establishment, the rest of the bureaucracy, starts to become engaged and pick up steam. And even a guy like Barack Obama, who said, I'm never going to do this, finds himself ordering bombing in Syria. And the same thing could happen in Europe, and that really worries me, because I think Putin is genuinely a mediocre intellect. He's a mediocre person who doesn't understand this.
Tom, I like to focus on one sub-issue related to Putin, and that is economically. I think everything I read on Russia was that it was slowing before. We've seen crude prices, frankly, come down after a good deal of time sitting around 100, but it's clearly under pressure. How much of this is pressure internally from an economic standpoint on Russia? That is to say, Russia is in a bad place. Does it make war more advantageous for Putin?
No. No, none of this. This thing that I wrote about a week and a half ago that George Will picked up. Let me just name check George Will and myself. One of the points I was trying to make, Putin doesn't. We keep looking for these very rational, mechanical, economical reasons why somebody like Putin is doing what he did. There was that ghastly John Mearsheimer piece about, it's all about realism, because every John Mearsheimer piece is all about why realism explains everything. It doesn't explain anything. And if you keep taking that approach, you're going to be frustrated, because Putin's a Soviet nostalgist. He's operating on gut and emotion and instinct. If he were really trying to do what's best for the Russian economy, he'd have stopped this a long time ago. There is no upside in trying to hold it. Now, some of my colleagues have pointed out things like, well, there's coal mines. Sure. If you can make that economical after years of sanctions, after taking the hits that Putin's going to take, pouring money into the infrastructure to modernize all that stuff, feeding all those people, building all those roads, there's only so many the East Ukraine especially, Donetsk and cities like that, there's only so many Detroits you can seize before it becomes very expensive. This cannot be explained either by reference to power politics or by economics. You have to understand what's going on in Putin's mind. And I don't know if you guys saw it went around Twitter and the social media a while back of Putin in Mongolia bursting into tears during his national anthem.
Yes,
because that's the Soviet national anthem. He restored it as the Russian national anthem. That is the Stalinist national anthem. And there was Putin in Mongolia, not usually a place that moves people to tears, and he just bursts out crying listening to this national anthem. This is a guy, my personal opinion, and this is not a scholarly opinion, this is just Tom Nichols as a middle-aged man. I think Putin's having the worst midlife crisis humanity's ever seen. I'm crapping you negative. He's taken up with a woman half his age, he's divorced his wife, and he's bursting into tears during Soviet national anthems while he's invading countries. I think he really believes that because he's in charge in Russia, Barack Obama is completely in charge in the United States, and he really that's going to lead to a drastic miscalculation down the line. All joking aside, that's extremely dangerous.
What about Estonia?
Just let me jump in for a second here, Jack, just to let people know. On the Twitter stream, I put Tom's article that he referenced just now up on the Twitter stream. It's important for people to read.
Thanks, Uncle Bob.
Thoughts about the kidnapping, whatever you want to call it, of the Estonian officer, the NATO event?
Very clearly, this is a message to Estonia. NATO can't protect you. We will screw with you at will, and Barack Obama and Angela Merkel and David Cameron aren't going to lift a finger to help you. The president went to Estonia and said, these Baltic capitals are as important to us as London, Paris, and Berlin. And Putin is saying, no, they're not. No, they're not. And I can prove they're not. And I unfortunately, again, so far he's getting away with it. This, on top of that, he wants the Lithuanians to help him prosecute deserters from the Red Army. I mean, talk about trolling NATO in a huge way. Like, we're going to go find guys that ditched the Red Army back in 1990. Give me a break. This is purely his way of saying, I can poke you right in the eye anytime I feel like it, and NATO isn't going to lift a finger to help you. And my problem is, he can do a lot of these things and be a colossal pain in the ass. The problem is when he tests Article 5, he may find out that a lot of NATO's processes are a lot more institutionalized and automatic than he realizes, because he thinks it's all going to come down to, a kind of Nixon in the White House midnight phone call where we're just going to say, oh, the hell with them. And it doesn't work that way. And I'm surprised that he doesn't know that, because the guys in his circle, smart asses like Rogozin, who's always on Twitter, always trolling the West, he was an investor in NATO. He knows better. They know that there are limits to what NATO can handle and what NATO will put up with, and they know that there is no way they could win any kind of a conflict with the West. This is purely, I think, and I'm also very worried about this. I'm very concerned that Putin thinks with Obama in office, he's got exactly 2 more years to squeeze everything he can get out of the West. And again, that could be a miscalculation. The president is the most powerful man in the world. He's the leader of a block of free nations. He's not God. He can't change reality on the ground if they go too far.
All right. So, quick question. Scotland, military. Are we about to have a nation that has to go out and start a military from scratch?
Well, Matthew may know. Matthew's probably a better guy to ask on that. My big concern is where are they going to put their subs? Their subs.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I'm a conservative with a small c, which is to say, generally speaking, I hate change. You know, that's
I'm not arguing with you on this one.
You know, conservatives by their nature they're always trying to conserve. That's where we get the name. We're trying to conserve what was, you know. And I didn't have any real strong feelings about this, except I don't think Scotland will be better off outside the United Kingdom. You know, you go from being part of a superpower or a major power, you know, a member of the Security Council, and you go to being sort of the newest member of the EU with a tiny GDP. I don't think it's a smart move, but strategically, the only thing I'm concerned about is that the British were already on the verge of talking about just getting rid of their nuclear deterrent, which you know, might not be the worst thing, might not be the bad choice down the line, but I'd rather see them get rid of their nuclear deterrent as a conscious strategic choice than simply die by default because the
ground to a halt.
Walked out.
Yeah. Well, and then here's the other one, and I'm just making a joke, but so please understand this is in the context of a joke. We could have a scenario where Britain has to have a naval base in Scotland for its nuclear fleet, much like Crimea, whatever that damn place is that Russia stole, which was where they had their base, right? So
every joke has an element of truth in it.
For their point,
you know, Freud said there are no jokes. But here's the irony again about Crimea. Putin didn't have to take it. He had a naval base there. He had a lease on Crimea until 2042.
Yeah.
It didn't make any sense. This was purely, I think it was a purely emotional reaction to Yanukovych being driven out of town. I'm starting to think that Putin actually believes some of the idiotic conspiracy theories that he was pushing about, you know, NATO being involved in this, all that stuff. But he didn't. If he wanted that base with no trouble, he had it. He didn't. He was already playing a winning hand, and he overreached, as the Russians always do.
All right. So let's go to Spain first, starting up with your thoughts on military Scotland, or lack of military.
All right, guys. Hi, Tom. Thanks. That was really interesting.
Hi, Matthew.
A military Scotland. What about Trident and the nuclear thing? They've there was an article the other day, I think it was in the Telegraph, about that maybe that goes into the packet of negotiations about the strategic pieces over the long term. So the same as the.
So does everybody get a nuclear submarine out of the deal? Is that it?
No. The idea was you become independent and get your own free nuclear stuff. No, the idea was that if you go to, because they're big strategic pieces like the currency, say, that kind of thing will go in the very long-term packet, and they'll do some kind of deal whereby they keep Trident in Faslane in Scotland for until 2025 or something like that. Okay. When the British have built another base on the south coast, by which time they can just move the subs and the missiles quite nicely, because I can't see them not using the. I mean, if anybody were ever to attack Scotland with a nuclear weapon, is London not going to reply in kind just because it's
right? That's part of the Canadian umbrella protection plan.
Especially if the Queen is still the head of state. I mean, they'll have to defend their corgis and pheasants and things.
Well, and again, just ask yourself, if someone's dropped a nuclear weapon on Scotland, what's happened in the world that happened? I think you probably have bigger questions going on than whether or not London's going to retaliate. And one of the things that really kind of scrapes my carrot about all of these nuclear scenarios is we never ask how did we get here? What is this war about? Why are we even thinking about this? Someone in my timeline just asking questions now about, well, you know, low yield nukes and precision. I keep saying to them, with all of these things, how is it that, you know, Britain's in a nuclear war? And I think until we answer those kinds of questions, because again, if the British don't want to have a nuclear deterrent, you know, that's an understandable position in the 21st century. But I would rather see them actually decide to do that than simply say, well, we're kicked out of Scotland, so just mothball everything. Because that's by doing it by default. That's strategy by default, which Americans are increasingly familiar with these days. Zing.
There's no game plan.
In terms of the non-nuclear options, there was an interesting article somewhere else the other day about a really good one about Catalonia and Scotland. If they become independent, maybe they can do a smaller specialized military thing which could be actually useful to NATO in some way. Basically about the maritime protection business. So you'd end up with a smaller Scottish thing focused on doing the North Atlantic and the islands and things like that, and a smaller Catalonian thing doing the same kind of thing but in the Mediterranean. And over time, maybe they could become like Denmark-type NATO countries that specialize in that kind of business. Because if we're talking about what they're thinking about at the minute with taking a few of the Scottish battalions from the army and a couple of the ships and a few of the air bases and a squadron of fighters, or however they end up doing it in the end, you can't do much with that kind of thing unless you go for a smaller specialized force. So that was an interesting idea.
All right. So what are your thoughts about Spain? How long are you going to stay riveted together, or are you going to split the sheets?
Who knows?
Go ahead, Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob, dive on in.
I mean, in our pre-show, I kind of gave you a heads up, Matthew, on kind of my question, which there was a lot of speculation in my reading on the Scotland vote that's upcoming and its potential impact in Catalonia. And I'd just like to get your thoughts. I do follow your Twitter stream as well as the Spain report that you publish, and I'm aware of the big demonstrations that went on this week. But just to get your thoughts generally on kind of how you think that vote may or may not impact Catalonia.
Okay, let's see. The Catalans are going to have a parliamentary session on the day after the Scottish vote. So the Scots vote is on Thursday. You probably know the result on Thursday night. On Friday morning, the Catalan Parliament is going to debate a regional referendum bill, which is and they're likely to pass it as well. And that's going to set the stage for them to call the referendum at the regional level, which will then kick in the Madrid's central government response, which is definitely going to be, they're going to appeal it to the Constitutional Court and get it struck off, okay, which is where all the problems are going to come in. But on the Friday morning, on the 19th, after the day after the Scottish vote, the Catalans are going to be able to sell it as a win for them either way you look at it, because the Scots are going to get a vote. So whatever happens, they're going to be able to say Scotland has had a democratic vote agreed upon by London. And whichever way it goes, the Catalans are going to be able to say that, because Madrid has been saying from the start, for 2 long years now, that it's just no, not no to a question, not no in answer to any question, but a direct no to any kind of vote. So on the Friday morning, they're going to say that whatever happens. If we get a yes vote in Scotland, Catalonia is going to go mad. They're going to love it. And they're going to feel excited on the one hand, because they're going to see a process that's working. But on the other hand, they're going to feel terribly frustrated as well, because they're in this situation in Catalonia where they're not allowed to have a vote by Madrid.
I think if Scotland votes yes, they're going to wake up in about a week or so with a serious political hangover. I think I think that's one of those things that it's going to sound great, and people, the yes momentum as we're building, and then when all the shouting and all the partying is done, a week later, 2 weeks later, people say, no, how does this actually work? And I think, we've seen it with Canada, in Quebec, that it all sounds great until you sit down and say, okay, let's actually pull this country apart and see what happens. And I think, I hope it doesn't happen. I don't think it's a disaster for the world. If I know a lot less about Catalonia than I do about the UK, so I can't say what it would do to Spain. But Matthew, just a question from me, if you don't mind some crosstalk. I mean, it seems like there's more tension about separatism in Spain than there is about separatism in Britain. I mean, in Britain, it'll be a kind of a velvet divorce, a sort of parting of the ways. I mean, Catalonia and Spain, there seems to be a lot more edginess involved in that. Is that right?
You're right. I think the same thing. It's a good perception, a good observation. I think basically it comes down to the two fundamentally different systems. Okay, so in Britain you've got two constitutional monarchies, two modern constitutional democracies, European parliamentary monarchies with prime ministers and things. So, but in London or in Britain you've got the English-speaking common law system, which is more reactive, more responsive to things that change as the situation changes. It looks at the situation on the ground, tries to adapt laws and institutions to what's happening, and over the course of centuries or decades, that those kinds of institutions in common law countries have proven to be very adaptive to the needs of history. Whereas in Spain, you've got a system, a legal system and a political system which is based on the Roman law concept, which is more prescriptive. Everything exists in legal codes, in big, huge legal books, and if it's not on the books, it's not part of the law. So what you've got, to a large extent, is those two philosophies placed into the different reactions to the different independent movements. So Cameron agreed on the he agreed on the vote, and he agreed on the question right from the start. Now he's getting into hot water because, hello, you guys still there?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So now he's getting into hot water because with just 10 days to go, you have this poll with a yes vote, and everybody's panicking in Westminster, and all the London press has finally woken up. And we might see Scotland become independent. I think they might vote yes. It's going to be an exciting few days. And maybe by the end of the week, we've got an independent Scotland that nobody in London really expected or thought would happen. And maybe part of the reason they agreed for it in the first place was because they thought it was just impossible for that kind of thing to happen in Scotland, in the United Kingdom in the 21st century. In Spain, from the very beginning, 2 years ago again, Madrid's position from the very beginning, again a principled position, was no, you're not even having a vote. Any vote is unconstitutional, and any vote is any attempt to have an unconstitutional vote, if the courts have said you can't do it, is therefore illegal in different ways. So this week we've had the Spain's version of the Attorney General on the radio talking about the different crimes that his office is preparing to investigate should the Catalans try to go down that path when the Constitutional Court declares it illegal. So different attitudes. Fundamentally, you've got an interesting theoretical or academic debate, because what you're looking at is two different versions of interpreting the word democracy. So the British version which is what the Catalans support. They see what's happening in the UK and Scotland, and they like it because that's what they want. They want a vote. They believe democracy is the vote, the will of the people, the voice of the people, the voting of the people, and that's above everything else. Whereas Madrid interprets democracy in terms of the constitutional approach to democracy with the rule of law. And says, no, you can be democratic and people can vote, but people can't just make it up as they go along just because they've got a majority, or they seem to have a majority in the streets. You can be democratic, but you must do it with
you know that the Americans have already, people, the unpleasantness of 150 years ago, we already decided this whole issue about whether or not secession is acceptable in the United States.
Although we do have California trying to break itself up into multiple pieces. So
that's all we need, more Californias. That's all we need, more Californias.
They had the last time the Catalans tried this, they've tried this before, okay? In 1934, 80 years ago this year, they tried this again, okay? It was in the middle of what was then the Second Spanish Republic, so there was no monarchy, and they went for it again. And the guy that was the first minister then, called Companys, said, okay, we're going to declare a Catalan Republic against the monarchist and fascist forces who want to destroy the Republic. And he declared an independent Catalonia, and it lasted about 10 or 11 hours, okay, because the Spanish Prime Minister of the time, of the day, a guy called Leroux, he decided to apply the Spanish laws of the time as well, and ordered the Captain General of Catalonia, which is how the Spanish military was organized then, to declare a state of war and fix the problem. So this general, guy called Batet, he did that and issued an edict saying there was a state of war in Catalonia. Now, they brought artillery pieces and machine guns onto the streets of Barcelona, attacked the seat of or assaulted the seat of the Catalan government. 46 people were killed, and they arrested the ministers. The Catalan Mossos, the sort of Catalan police force, they ended up surrendering to the Spanish Civil Guard and the Spanish army after 10 or 11 hours. They arrested all of the ministers, threw them in jail while they were awaiting trial. They were eventually sentenced to 30 years in jail, and they suspended self-government or regional government in Catalonia and appointed a civil governor from Madrid. So the last time they tried this, it didn't end well. It didn't last long, and it didn't end well. This time, would they try something like that in the 21st century? I don't know. Does Rajoy have the balls to send soldiers or police to Barcelona to try and arrest Mas and his friends for sedition or for rebellion? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. It's going to be fun to watch.
Well, one of the interesting distinctions I see as a third-party observer between the whole Scotland situation and the Barcelona situation is kind of Barcelona is basically where the money is made, or where a substantial portion of Spain's money is made. Whereas, and potentially that was true, 40 years or 35 years ago in Scotland, but as North Sea crude is increasingly drying up, that's clearly not the case now.
I agree. I think that's the case, isn't it? The percentages are higher in Catalonia. Catalonia is like 19% of Spanish GDP, 26% of exports. So if Catalonia goes or tries to go, that creates a huge problem, systemic problem for the Spanish economy, and the Spanish economy is systemic within Europe. So then you get a great big sucking sound in Europe, and then maybe it goes global. I don't know. There's a guy called Junqueras, there's parliamentary ally of the First Minister of Catalonia. He's Republican left-wing, Republican as in he wants a republic, not a monarchy, left-wing secessionist, okay, a bit more of a colourful character than the First Minister, not quite an elitist politician. And he's been in the newspapers over the summer warning, kind of giving these veiled threats or warnings that if Madrid doesn't allow a vote in November, then global markets should be worried about that, because Catalonia is such a big chunk of the Spanish economy.
You know, every one of these, every secession movement always makes the argument that smaller is beautiful, smaller is better, and we'll always be better off without the heavy hand of the central government on us. I don't know if that's true in Spain. I think I don't know enough about Spain to know if that's true, but it seems to me it seems to me that at some point you fission these units down to the point where, look at Europe, right? Europe has all these countries in it, and now they've spent 20 years trying to put themselves back together in some kind of united economy. And I think there's always the notion that local control is better. Here in the United States, that's a big argument between liberals and conservatives. Is local control better than federal control? Is taxation close to the source, or spending close to the source of taxation? But to me, it always seems such a risk to jump into the European economy and to end up being the next Greece or Ireland or Italy or Spain or Portugal, because you went into it with these. Because one of the things that every new government's going to have to do, whether it's Scotland or Catalonia or anybody else, is they're going to have to make a lot of people happy in that new country, and they're going to have to spend a lot of money, and they're going the startup costs. What do we want to call it economically? Barriers to entry as a new state. Are significant, and I think secession is one of those things that always sounds better. Look at Czechoslovakia. Worked out fine for the Czech Republic. Slovakia, maybe not so much.
No one ever brings them up, though.
Well, right. People. Ask most people. Everybody knows where the Czech Republic is. Say, quick. Now, where's the other half of it? And they'll sort of shrug and go, "Oh."
Yeah. Right. Tom. I think you raise excellent points that have really been brought out by the English press. People that have been following this for some time know exactly what Matt said, which is that this thing really just was on the back pages, and then all of a sudden that vote came out, I guess a week ago Friday, and then it became like the key issue, and the politicians and the press kind of ran to the ran to raise all these issues, and many of them are very good issues. And what is, I guess somewhat surprising to me is that the separatists in Scotland really didn't, as far as I'm concerned, have many answers for many of the questions you raised.
I don't think they expected this to happen.
No,
this is one of those things that, again, closer to home here in North America, it struck me that the last time the Canadians did this, one of the reasons it went down is that, at the last minute everybody said, oh, we're being taken seriously about this? Like this could really happen? And then everybody kind of backed up and said, no, wait a minute, it's great to talk about it. Everybody likes to bitch about being part of a federal system, but then to say, no, we actually are going to have to come up with, our own borders and our own cops and our own... Of course, if you're already in that situation, it makes it easier. And one of the things that made it easy to break apart the Soviet Union was that the Soviet authorities were dumb enough to let all of the republics form their own little parliaments and presidents and ministries and all of that stuff. So there were ready-made governments in waiting to just roll out and go. As it turns out, even those didn't function very well. But I mean, I'm curious to see, what happens on day one. It's going to take like 2 years for Scotland to get up and running as an independent thing. And just to bring it back to your Middle East question that you asked at the top of the show. ISIS is not a state. The Islamic State is not a, I know that meme's been going around. It's not Islamic and it's not a state. But it's certainly not a state. It is in no way anything that any, I don't want to say political scientist, but any observer of politics would call a state. It's simply a large territory that's under the control of a lot of armed guys at the moment. So I think, this notion that, well, we have to talk to them because they're a state, or there's been some really crazy stuff out there about, well, they provide services, they're an essential, they're acting like a government. That I think that's horse shit, actually.
Ooh. Yeah, no, I fully agree with you on that count. I think what has also been interesting in terms of this Scotland vote that's coming up is that the other side not only didn't have ready-made answers, the answers that they tried to put forward, I thought, were really kind of lame. Now, interestingly enough, and Matthew, perhaps you can speak to this, I saw some polling data that has been run since the Second World War, where nationalism, if you will, for lack of a better word, within Scotland has continued to grow throughout that period. And I really didn't, the article really didn't speak to what the genesis of that was. Any thoughts? On
why nationalism has grown in Scotland over the last few decades?
Yes.
Margaret Thatcher, basically.
Really?
The Scots hated Margaret Thatcher. The Tory party, the Conservative Party, now has 1 seat in Scotland. Out there, I can't remember how many the total is at the minute, but they've got one. They've got 1 MP compared to like 40 for Labour and a few more for the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Nationalist Party.
Oh, that's a whole other thing. The British Parliament gets ripped up. I hadn't even really thought about that.
It loses some MPs. Might be more efficient even. I know.
Yeah.
It might be a good thing. It loses some MPs. Most of them will be Labour. So if this is a similar dynamic to Spain and Catalonia, in fact, I think if we get an independent Scotland, it basically means it's going to be extremely difficult for the Labour government in Westminster to ever get back into power because they're going to lose 40 MPs, 40 seats in one blow, whereas the Conservatives only lose 1. And I think in Spain with Catalonia, it's a similar dynamic. Not exactly the same, but it's similar because they're going to lose a lot of the regionalist support that they used to have for the thing, and that's going to benefit the right-wing party in Spain. So that's very interesting.
One thing that Matthew kind of made me think of when he said, well, it's because of Margaret Thatcher. A lot of these movements are driven by younger people, wherever they are. And I wonder, well, these people hate Margaret Thatcher. I wonder how many of these people that are going to vote yes, or even a lot, hate Margaret Thatcher simply because they have no memory of somebody like James Callaghan. To say, well, okay, without Margaret Thatcher, we don't want to go back to the 1980s. We want to go back to what, 1976, 77? Good luck with that. I mean, it's not for me to tell any British citizen which prime minister to like or not like, but it seems to me that, if you what was the golden age before that? You know, the early 70s, Britain paralyzed.
We have to go back a long way for.
Yeah.
For that.
So.
All right. So I got a question now. Let's go to ISIS. We had the vote. We're going to start becoming involved there a bit more. I'll call it more.
Vote.
Well, not a vote.
No, we have a vote.
Are we going to do the vote? Because he asked for a vote.
This is you know, for somebody like me who's basically a solid supporter of executive power. I mean, I believe, you know, I made this point when I worked in the Senate during the first Gulf War that, you know, Article 2 and treaty obligations allow the president to do a lot of things. The administration, to me, seems to be pursuing 3 or 4 different theories of executive power here. I mean, they're even going back and saying, well, the authorization for the use of military force that just a month ago we were telling you we didn't need anymore, well, that's good enough. But also we can do it under, you know, sort of general obligations and the power of the presidency. I'm always concerned about having a vote, only in the sense of these authorizations for the use of military force tend to be these kind of cobbled together, generic statement of principles that always authorize the president to go and do good things. Go do something good for American security. And by the way, if it goes wrong, you know, there's almost that part that's written in lemon juice, you know, the invisible ink part that says, and if things go wrong, we'll all say that this authorization didn't mean anything that we said it meant. And so I almost kind of wish we wouldn't go through that charade. If we want to go to a war footing, and this is, a lot of people have said, well, why, you know, does it matter what word we use? Do we need a declaration of war? If we're going to actually go to a war footing, which we should have done, I mean, I would say one of the biggest criticisms you can make of George Bush is that he tried to have 2 wars at the same time without extracting any price from the American people, without any sacrifice whatsoever. If you want to go to a war footing, then you have to use terms like war, and Congress has to get involved. If on the other hand, this is going to be that we're just going to mow the lawn occasionally and just go in and sort of bomb ISIS to kind of keep them out of our soup, then I don't really think he needs
almost Grenada event.
Pardon me?
Almost Grenada, where it's
kind
of there.
Again, you know, the president could say in Grenada he had no time to act. They're all using the War Powers Act the same way. They're using this very specific language that says the presidents always report to Congress consistent with the War Powers Act. In other words, they're not really obedient to or in accordance with. They say, well, if it's language that almost says, if the War Powers Act were really a law we pay attention to, this is the letter I would write.
Tom, I think that's precisely correct. I mean, the fact is that this is a landmine area for representatives. The Democrats, you know,
they don't want it. They don't want the responsibility of voting on this. Neither party.
Neither party really does. So, you know, John McCain and Leslie Graham do, but they're a whole other issue unto themselves. Obama has specifically said he doesn't. You know, he wasn't looking for a vote. He thinks he's got authority. You know, if
I think that's a very consistent. I think that's a wise position. I think it's a consistent position. My only beef is I wish that would have been the president's position a year ago, the first time around when Syria came up, because when he punted the Syria decision a year ago, he empowered Congress, or let's put it this way, he tried to empower Congress. Congress immediately said, I'm not touching this hot potato that you just threw down Pennsylvania Avenue. But he was making an argument that, well, he tried to make 2 arguments at once. Well, I don't really need Congress, but I want them to vote on it anyway. And I think it's just cleaner to say, unless there is a, you know, I don't know, you know, Bush got his authorization of military force after 9/11. I think it was a unique circumstance. I think by and large, I think the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. I think it's a bad law. I think we should have junked it a long time ago. I don't think it's ever a good idea to tell the enemy that we fight our wars in 90-minute or 90-day increments, after which we'll have big fights in Congress. And I kind of respect all of the presidents of both parties who have just sort of gingerly stepped around that War Powers Act. But we have to kind of decide what our theory of our executive power is.
How about this? Is there a need for a War Powers Act if we actually declare war? There isn't. So isn't the War Powers Act kind of like the gray zone to allow the executive group to get up to trouble?
That's imputing far more coherence to the War Powers Act than it ever actually had. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973 because a group of congressmen were pissed at Richard Nixon about Vietnam. That's basically, it was a fit of pique. And they passed the War Powers Act. Nixon vetoed it. The great line about the War Powers Act is that Bork, who was Nixon's legal advisor, said, I think it was a Solicitor General, he said, you know, you should write on this, thank you for your essay on my constitutional powers. When I have time, I will write you an essay on yours. and put it along with the veto. And, you know, they overrode the veto because, again, Nixon took, because of Nixon being Nixon and Kissinger being Kissinger, they did a lot of things that were really enraging to Congress. But, of course, Vietnam was Lyndon Johnson's war. They inherited it. Congress had to blame somebody because Congress, let's remember, are the guys that passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in the first place that basically gave the president omnipotent scope to conduct the war as he pleased. Because, again, Congress didn't want the responsibility of saying, we're on board. They said, here you go, Mr. President, and I actually think that's healthy. The president is the steward of foreign policy. To have Congress constantly voting, Congress gets to vote on money. That's what they do. That's where their control is.
I mean, I think you know, Congress, they recognize that this is a minefield that they don't want to get into. They love to opine on different media shows, be they the Sunday shows or shows during the week, and sit there and wax prosaic, or you know, you get Leslie Graham and John McCain banging the table. But the fact is that the vast majority of members of Congress don't want to touch this thing with a 10-foot pole. It's nothing but disaster for them. They are not in a position to make these decisions, frankly, in my estimation.
Well, and again, you have to ask, what is it they would be voting on? If you went to them and said, I want what? An authorization for use of military force against ISIS? Well, then we'll start splitting the hairs about, well, who's a member of ISIS? Who's an affiliated member? It's like we're doing with Al-Qaeda since 2001. Which is this group actually part of the group that attacked us on? You know, we've gone through this very careful political kabuki about everybody we've attacked in some way has some sort of connection to the group that attacked us on 9/11. It's impossible to do foreign policy that way. That's how lawyers conduct foreign policy. And, you know, there's a reason that lawyers, you know, are lawyers. They do things differently. They're about process. The presidency is a different animal entirely. And I think, you know, things like these authorizations for the use of military force show you that we are a lawyered-up country. We have a lot of lawyers who are legislators. They think that way. But when it comes time to actually, you know, drop bombs on people, it's a different process. You can't think of it that way.
So, Tom, can you articulate the U.S. foreign policy?
No. This is a good time to say I don't speak for the government. I'm here in my own capacity.
Yes.
But I just don't. The president repeatedly said the other night, this is our strategy. This is our strategy. And I heard a general goal of kind of squashing ISIS. I wasn't clear on how. But
it's not a war. And we're only kinetically impacting them, but we're not. That was the thing that got to me was it's not a war, but it's a war, but it's not a war.
I agree with the people who are very concerned about this because of the fact that it seems that we finally got to this because of the beheadings of these two journalists. You know, if it was important to get in beforehand, if it was this important to get in now, then it was important to get in 6 months ago. And I'm a little worried that this is the kind of, well, a bunch of people want me to do something, so I'm going to do something. And I beyond that, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I'm glad. I think anything that kills a bunch of guys in ISIS and disrupts their supply lines and keeps them away from important areas in Iraq, I think that's all to the good. But that's treating the symptom rather than curing the disease. I mean, that's the equivalent of, you know, taking painkillers for cancer. That you can, it's a palliative thing, makes you feel better, it kind of staves things off, but it doesn't keep things from getting any worse. And so I mean, it was only a 15-minute speech. That was the first thing that surprised me. So the president's going to lay out a strategy. He's going to go in there and tell us what's what. And I thought, well, this is going to be a 30, 40-minute thing. And instead it was 15 minutes of basically, I heard you. These guys are bad guys. I'm going to kill some of them. God bless America.
Yeah, I mean,
so I don't know what the strategy is.
I think it was entirely and this is no disrespect to the president or what he said, but I think it was all very poll-tested answers to poll-tested questions, and that's where you get into that issue that you're raising, Tom, where it's we're going to do whatever it takes, but we're only going to do this. I mean, this is where we have found ourselves. And
but I don't think it's just President Obama. I think let me just back up. In fairness, I look at a longer sweep of history here. I think with each of the administrations since the end of the Cold War, because the Cold War was our defining kind of, what did Hillary Clinton call it, our organizing principle, right? And I think in every administration there's been one moment of principle where the president does something the public isn't crazy about. With Clinton, it was Bosnia and Kosovo. With Bush, it wasn't actually the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. It was the surge, where every poll told him not to do it. We haven't yet. I don't think we've had that moment where President Obama, it might have been last summer when everybody in the world, it's certainly a lot of Americans were upset about what Assad did, but I haven't seen a moment yet where he kind of goes upstream against the polls. With that said, our foreign policy for 20 years, since 1982, has basically been poll-driven foreign policy because we don't have the existential threat to our existence. And I really wish people would stop calling ISIS an existential threat. I know there are many congressmen who do it. I know, there have been some administration people do it. 20,000 nuclear warheads vaporizing a country is an existential threat. Guys beheading people in the Middle East is a horror. It's a crime against humanity. It's not an existential threat to the well-being of the United States of America. That doesn't mean I don't think we ought to go in and kill them, but I think we ought to be careful about the language we're using.
Indeed, well said. I mean, that's something I echo. It's akin to the constant use of the homeland. I don't live.
I wish we could ban that word.
I live in the United States, and when it's just as easy and nearly the same, only one extra syllable to say the United States versus saying the homeland, I just don't understand it. It was a confection developed by some
bureaucrat.
It was a bureaucrat in D.C. that had to come up with the DHS, and now it has become the nomenclature that we utilize every day on TV. It makes.
And if I were an American ally, that word would really bother me too, because it's for the first time, the Americans, since the end of the Cold War, are really making this distinction between the lower 48 and everybody else. I mean, in a way, even though when we say homeland, we mean the 50 states. To me, it even has the connotation of North America. If I were a Hawaiian, I wouldn't like the word homeland because Hawaii is not, you have to sort of capture that politically to call it the homeland. I think you think the homeland, most Americans see a map of the United States below Canada, and I think that's terrible. I think it's a clunky word. I think the Department of Homeland Security is one of those words that sounded better in the original German. I think it was a bad reaction to 9/11. One of the many mistakes we made when we were in this stampede to do something after 9/11. I agree with you. I wish there are some words I wish we could chase right out of the political lexicon. Homeland is one of them. Threats to the sovereignty of the United States.
Well, you guys, the fatherland was already taken and the motherland was already taken. So we had to come up with the homeland.
But yeah, here's why I think that word bothers so many Americans. The United States is not an ethnic construction. The United States is a political construction. It's composed of people from other places. There is no, other than Native Americans, obviously, there is no such thing as a United States ethnic identity. And when you use homeland, it sounds like blood and soil and genetic destiny and ideas, and it's creepy. I can understand where somebody you know, if you're a European who's, you know, country, you've lived in the same country for your people have lived in the same country for 1,000 years, going all the way back to Roman ruins. Talk about the homeland and the British people, the French people, whatever it is. Americans aren't like that. We're not a blood and genetics kind of group of people. We're all from someplace else. And to talk about the homeland is just it's very kind of exclusionary, weird, sort of almost racially tinged language. That really sounds like the 1930s.
The American
race. There is no American race. Again, unless with the obvious exception of Native Americans, there is no American race. So, you know, what is our homeland? I mean, you know, for most of us, it's at least here in New England, for most of us, it's Ireland. You know,
yeah.
the rest of the homeland mean, you know, Dublin. So. I just think
on this breaking bombshell, we're down to the last 4 minutes, so let us go back to Spain and give him 2 minutes of wind-up time.
No, I don't agree. I think I've always seen the Homeland Security thing in America as just more like a big interior ministry, and we've all got those over here in Europe, like a big home office or a big interior ministry, because you guys, as far as I understand, you didn't used to have that, did you? You had State for Foreign Affairs, but you had no one.
We have a department. No, we've always had a Department of the Interior, but they do things like administer national parks.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's about it.
Interior ministries over here sort of bring together police and domestic intelligence services and all the rest of it. So I've never thought of it like that. I've never had a problem with the word homeland specifically. I always just thought of it as kind of
because you're a European.
Maybe a full-on version of the Home Office in Britain or an interior ministry in Spain or something like that. No, it's fine. No.
But we're a federal state. We're 50 separate states, and you know that I was watching the HBO John Adams series again, which I really recommend to anybody who loves U.S. history. And there's a wonderful moment in it. It's pre-revolutionary, but at one point somebody questions John Adams' loyalty, and he says, "Massachusetts is my country, sir." And you know, for Americans to say, well, these big institutions we have those interior ministries. They're called the state police in 50 different states. The idea of having a national one just so rubs our national character the wrong way.
That sounds like Spain.
Yeah.
All right.
We've already had our secession debate, as I said. So.
Yeah. All right. On that point, I want to thank both of you for having joined us. This is the Macro Tourist Hour. Uncle Bob, what do you have to say? What's your last moment?
I'd just like to thank these two gentlemen for joining us. You know, I think we have more to see this week as more of the drib drab of what we're going to do in Syria comes out. The numbers are increasing. I think by end of I guess shortly after the elections, I expect that we'll have over 5,000 men and women in military people back in Iraq.
All right.
We'll be bombing Syria before the elections. That's my prediction.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, gentlemen. This is the Macro Tourist Hour. We'll be back next Sunday. Thank you. And everyone stay in the room for a moment. I have one quick question.